When I was still a student working my way through undergrad, one of the games I put a lot of time into was Capcom's Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, an arcade puzzle game that pits two players against each other in a high-stakes block-sorting frenzy. I was always inviting friends to try it out, and it became something of a fixture in our game rotations. For me, Puzzle Fighter was the supreme competitive puzzle game. It was both fun and fast-paced without being frustrating. When Capcom announced the game was being brought back in a new mobile title, I was optimistic. Unfortunately, it f***ing sucked. I'd more or less resigned myself to never playing a proper sequel to one of my favorite games of all time, but because of my love of Puzzle Fighter, I started trying out other competitive puzzle games. I picked up Puyo Puyo Tetris, Tetris Attack, and many others just to give the genre another shot. I ended up finding a number of really fun games along the way, actually, but this new open-minded policy yielded unexpected fruit when I decided I'd try my hand at a total newcomer. Crystal Crisis is a game released in 2019 by Nicholas, the publisher for games like Cave Story Plus and The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. Right out the gate, this game catches your eye with some unexpected guest characters on the box. Is that Astro Boy? Yes it is. I really didn't know exactly what to expect when I picked this game up. I've recently taken a liking to kind of rolling the dice and grabbing games priced under $20 on a whim. I did one single online search before making my purchase, and it was there that I saw a comparison I didn't expect. Puzzle Fighter. I didn't need much more convincing. First thing I want to comment on is that I've noticed physical copies of Nicholas titles may often include an instruction book. Now, these were a mainstay in gaming for several decades, but have more or less been phased out of existence as companies try to cut costs. For people like me who enjoy reading colorful pieces of paper, games that still come with a manual get a thumbs up by default. Crystal Crisis is among them. Now, as everyone knows, once the game is actually in your machine, one of the only ways to know whether or not you bought something worthwhile is the opening cinematic. The first 30 seconds are your standard anime cliche nonsense about some powerful crystal that's going to serve as the major plot point for most of the game's lore. But what makes it stand out is the voice that's explaining it. To some, it's Optimus Prime. To me, it's old Toonami ads. However you may remember him, Peter Cullen is the narrator of Crystal Crisis. Now from here we get into our animated sequence. That's more like it. Listen to that EDM. Look at how the characters are all making their grand entrance. This is what I was looking for. Everything about this cinematic is your standard cliche anime opening. It's clear right away what kind of people worked on this game. My kind of people. Now, initial impressions are that Quote is the real main character, but it's a fighting game, so that doesn't really matter all that much. Now, immediately after you start the game is the option to play the tutorial, which you should absolutely do because it's how you unlock one of the playable characters. Johnny Turbo takes you through the basic controls and mechanics, which is something a lot of puzzle games would stand to benefit from. It's quick, informative, and overall not too much of a pain to do so. Place your crystals in your grid and try to keep crystals of the same color adjacent to one another. When a spark crystal of the corresponding color shows up, connect it to the matching color, and that's how you clear your board. Having finished the tutorial, it was here that my hopes were fully realized. Crystal Crisis isn't just similar to Puzzle Fighter, it is Puzzle Fighter. Now, there are plenty of strategies that can come into play here, from setting up chains to building larger blocks out of your crystals. It's the Puzzle Fighter experience, and it's personally my favorite kind when it comes to puzzle games. Crystal Crisis brings two specific major changes into the fold that make it its own game. The first is that you can actually wrap your crystals around the edges of the board, which allows you to essentially split them in half or create unique combinations, particularly useful if you need to reach the other side even if there's a tower blocking the center lanes. The second, and arguably most notable change, is the advent of special moves through a meter called the Burst Meter. The Puzzle Fighter mobile game tried to include some sort of special move, but it really didn't work. It didn't feel fun. Crystal Crisis takes the idea and actually does it properly. Each character has an attack burst and a defense burst that is unique to whichever character you're using. Now, these burst moves are without a doubt the most significant change to the Puzzle Fighter formula and can dramatically alter the flow of a match. I suggest looking into each character to find out for yourself which you like most. They can range anywhere from scrambling the opponent's blocks to completely swapping your board with the opponent, so there's a lot of variety here, and it's really going to come down to how you like to play. The true way to play a fighting game out of the box, in my opinion, is to try your hand at the arcade mode first and foremost. It's the way these games were meant to be played in the first place. Now, I went with the medium difficulty, which meant 8 matches in a row. The overall experience was exactly like I'd hoped. It was Puzzle Fighter, albeit with strange new characters and 3D graphics. Immediately after finishing the arcade mode, I unlocked 5 characters all at once, and combined with Johnny Turbo from the tutorial, that meant I only had some 3 or 4 left over out of the total 20. I really think there's a delicate balance to handling character unlocks in games, as some players would like to unlock them as fast as possible, while people like me enjoy working my way through the roster piecemeal so each new unlock feels more significant. On the subject of characters, let's take a minute and look at just who is in the game. Across the board, many of the characters are from different Nicalis-published titles, which makes this a fun fan service opportunity for fans of those games. Probably the biggest surprise is the inclusion of Astro Boy and Blackjack, two characters from the works of Osamu Tezuka. Astro Boy in particular really fits in among the crowd. Most out of place among the heroes is probably Isaac from Binding of Isaac. Beyond that, many of the characters feel like generic placeholders when measured up to the named characters from already existing games. A knight named Knight and zombie named Zombie don't exactly inspire creativity. Still, despite their generic designs, they at least fit the overall presentation. If they were put into another Nicalis game in the future, it would probably improve their standing among the cast. Now, character unlocks aside, once I finished up arcade mode, I went ahead and tried out the story mode. The basic plot, as described by the opening cinematic, is that a red crystal of power has caused all the different worlds to overlap with one another. All of the characters in the game are after that crystal for one reason or another. In each chapter, two of the characters will clash for some reason in their pursuit of the crystal. The gimmick in this story mode is being able to pick which character you'll play as, which results in a branching path scenario. I can't exactly say that the story does anything particularly fancy, and the flowchart behind its events wasn't so clear to me in my first time through. That said, it was enjoyable enough because at the end of the day, I'm still playing Puzzle Fighter and that's all that really matters. Beyond your arcade and story modes are a number of additional game types. Versus mode is your standard fare that lets you hop into matches with custom settings. Among the many different game types, tag team mode is easily a standout. Essentially, players get two characters and will have access to each of their burst abilities in addition to a unique game board for each of them to build with. The game can also support up to 4 players for head-to-head battles, which is, to my knowledge, a first within the Puzzle Fighter archetype. There's a lot of craziness that can come from the overall Crystal Crisis take on an old formula, but that really makes the experience that much more fun. Your heart might start racing as things get more intense and you wait for that next polycrystal to bail you out before the opponent can finish you off. It's these kind of experiences that really defined Puzzle Fighter, and they're improved upon with Crystal Crisis. The additional game modes really open things up for a lot of fun. I'm definitely a big fan of the aforementioned tag team mode. It's like playing Tekken Tag Tournament with a puzzle game. What more could you ask for? Now, Crystal Crisis has a very large gallery of extra content that players can view at their leisure, which mainly includes things like concept art. This is another one of those things where unlocking stuff one at a time by playing the game would probably have been more artificially rewarding, but an unnecessary time sink. No complaints from me on this one. The music player in this game is one of the few things gate-kept by unlocking characters, as well as some of the stages. The music itself is pretty good, though a little all over the place at times. Aside from the common electronic elements in all of the songs, it really feels like each track was made uniquely for each character, without as much of a regard for the cohesive game soundtrack, which ends up making it feel like you're going from some upbeat EDM to suddenly Michael Jackson's Thriller to a jazzy Marvel vs. Capcom 2 stage and then suddenly Kingdom Hearts. Variety is the spice of life. It certainly isn't a bad thing. The song playing right now is Blackjack's theme, and it's honestly the standout for me as the best track in the game, yet also as the most deviant from the others in its actual composition. The easiest way to describe the OST for me is something of a personal comparison. It makes me feel like I'm back in my college days when I was working with a lot of electronic DJs. It's the kind of music I'd have downloaded off of Newgrounds to listen to while I was walking around back in high school. I like it. Whether or not it feels on brand for a fast-paced puzzle game changes between each track, but some do a great job and others not as much. All in all though, I like it. There are only 2 things that I initially found to be worth bringing up as demerits within Crystal Crisis. The first is the loading time. Everything feels like it takes a really significant amount of time to load between matches. Now this would be standard some 15 years ago, but in the modern era, it's not typical for loading screens to slow down your experience with 10 to 30 second waits. On the bright side, this allows for brief things like checking my phone or thinking about how long it's going to take this time to load the game. The second issue is one that's more of a personal preference. Crystal Crisis orients the grid on a slightly angled 3/4 perspective, which can kind of make it hard to see exactly where things line up when you compare them to your standard front-facing puzzle grid. At least, I considered this to be a downside until I went into the game's options for the first time after finishing the story. As it turns out, you can completely disable that angled perspective and play it like a traditional puzzle game. And while we're on the subject of options, that's definitely far from the only one. Most praiseworthy is the inclusion of a colorblind palette for the crystals. Many years ago, I remember playing Puzzle Fighter with a guy at CEO, and despite how good he was at the game, he also told me about the challenges he faced being colorblind. Knowing that the game developers took that into consideration and improved on this limitation to other players really makes the team that much more praiseworthy. Beyond that, there are also color palettes for each character should you prefer to use them. Additionally, players can also modify the shaders around each of the characters in the settings, which really lets you take more control of your overall experience. Same thing with your menu colors. Long story short, Crystal Crisis offers a surprising amount of customization that makes for a more personalized experience. As a strange side note, when I finished the game, I was really surprised to see that the credits were almost entirely Western names. I say this because the game comes across as Japanese from top to bottom. Aside from the obvious Astro Boy, Blackjack, and Cave Story IPs being Japanese, there are only 2 English-speaking voices in the entire game. The narration by Peter Cullen, and the voice of Johnny Turbo, whose actor is the real-life person the character was based on. Every other character is voiced in Japanese. Now, I found this kind of strange, though it makes things feel more like Puzzle Fighter, which I think was the entire point. Picking up Crystal Crisis, I really did not expect it to be a one-to-one proper sequel to Puzzle Fighter. Fortunately for me, it turned out to be just that. And honestly, that made it that much more satisfying. It was the ideal outcome for a player like me who has desperately been wanting a new Puzzle Fighter game that wasn't garbage. I can't believe that it took someone else deciding to do it for this game to even exist, but that seems to be the trend these days with retired franchises. Often it looks like we're going to have to look to other studios because the people who own the original IPs just don't want to make the games. On its own merits, Crystal Crisis is very fun. It may not be as quick to pick up and play as Puzzle Fighter thanks to things like loading times, but it is absolutely one of those games that for me is exactly what I was looking for. Crystal Crisis is a must-play, must-own game if you're a puzzle fan. Now, if all the things I've said sound like something for you, I highly suggest checking it out. I honestly see myself picking up and playing it in the years to come, which is really a long-lasting testament to the quality of the game. Sometimes game developers will try to take an old idea and improve on it in their own way, and the results can be good or bad. But in this case, it's very obvious to me that the people who worked on Crystal Crisis know what made Puzzle Fighter fun in the first place. And more than that, they knew how they could make it even better. Thanks for checking out my review. If you'd like more videos like this, be sure to let me know in the comments. I've always been a big fan of making video reviews, but I've always found them to be some of my more personal work compared to some of the other stuff here on my channel. Nonetheless, be sure to subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching. This is Stanpai. I'll see you next time.